Plato's Cave is produced by Muckraker Media. You can find out more at muckrakermedia.org. Welcome to Plato's Cave. I'm Jordan Myers, and today we're going to take another step towards exiting the cave by speaking to the public historian Justin Clark. I'm recording this just after I finished speaking with him, and it was a really interesting conversation. We didn't speak about a single thing that I had on the to talk about list, but like I told Justin, I think that's a mark of a good guest and a good conversation. We discussed a lot of things, honestly. The philosophy underlying different political stances, what's wrong with the American political system, what he thinks is ethically and morally correct in a political philosophy framework. I think it was a really interesting conversation. And, you know, we touched a lot of hot button topics, which I think will, you know, he brought up a lot of really good points for a lot of unconventional political positions. And I think, you know, it's an interesting thing as a personal exercise for me to hear. And I think it's a really good exercise for a lot of, you know, any listeners out there to hear. So, you know, that's all I have to say for now. And I hope that you get as much out of this talk as I got. So here's the episode. Well, with me today, I have Justin Clark. He is a public historian that I'm very interested to talk to about, I think, a kind of a broad-ranging set of topics today. So, Justin, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So we were just talking before we started recording about some of your past projects, but because I know that you said that you used to do a podcast, but was it multiple that you used to do?
Yeah, I used to do a few different podcasts. Back when I was heavily involved in sort of the, you know, atheist, secular, humanist community, I did 3 shows. The first one I did was a weekly show I called An Army of Principles, which is a quote from Thomas Paine. It's a great quote where he says, "An army of principles can penetrate where an army of soldiers cannot." And so that was sort of where the name came from. And that was a weekly show, sort of a topical show where I went over news topics. The second show I did was a show called Secular Nation, which was a podcast I did for the Atheist Alliance of America. And I was involved with that organization for a few months. And then I became very disillusioned with the leadership and very bothered by a lot of what was going on behind the scenes in terms of the organization. So I left that organization almost 3 years ago now. And I started my own project called Reason Revolution, which was sort of the last sort of big secular project I did. And about 2 years ago, I sort of had, ironically enough, for me, I sort of had a crisis of faith. I was just sort of like, why am I so obsessed with talking about atheism all the time? And at the time, my politics were also starting to change. I used to have pretty, I would say, sort of boring, vanilla, sort of neoliberal politics. And I realized that a lot of the people who I had admired sort of in the broader secular community had politics and honestly just views in general that I thought were extremely reactionary and sort of backward. And some of them I thought were just downright immoral. And I just had and then I sort of had like a falling out with my partner on that project and so at some point I just sort of had like a epiphany of like, I just don't want to do this anymore. And that was around the time that I found a book that sort of changed my life in a lot of ways. And it was a book called Essentialism, The Disciplined Pursuit of Less by Greg McKeown. And that book kind of changed my life. I wrote an article about it, which I think is available on the Muckraker website now, and about sort of, you know, decluttering your life and sort of finding your purpose. And so for me, it was basically like, why these things? I don't get paid to do them. I don't particularly enjoy doing them anymore. I don't find them valuable. And I just sort of stopped doing them. And I stopped doing that. And, you know, I sort of reconfigured how I was living my life, focused more on my career. And now what I do now, between most of my job, which keeps me pretty busy, but now I'm just a writer. I just write for my website, justinclark.org. And then that stuff's going to be out on the Muckraker Media network. So I'm very happy about that. It's to just do stuff that's just me. It doesn't have a name. It doesn't have a brand proposition. It's just me. So I can
Yeah.
just talk about what I want.
Yeah, no, it's it's funny that you say that because honestly, I mean, the past couple of months, I've kind of felt the same way where it's just like, I feel like a lot of people talk about, oh, like I gotta do more, I gotta do more. I feel the exact opposite. I'm just like, I need to do way less. I feel spread so damn thin all the time. And it's just, I almost feel like I almost want to make a list of like 4 or 5 things I'm allowed to do, and I can't do it if it's not on the list. Just like choose, the things that are just the most enjoyable, short term and long term combined, however you want to weigh that balance, and just stick to those things. Just make it simple.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. There are two things I'll sort of follow up with that. First off, one rule that I always kind of follow that is a good rule of thumb is if it's not a 100% yes, it's a 100% no.
Yeah. Is
And
that Tim
so
Ferriss?
it might be, I'm not
Okay.
sure.
Okay.
It's something that I remember reading in the McEwen book. And it may have been something he got from him or like Peter Drucker or somebody, one of
Hmm.
those like management guys. But that's something that really stuck with me. The other thing that really stuck for me with the book was there was a designer for Braun from Germany. He was a guy named Dieter Rams. And his sort of attitude about life was in German, I'm going to say it badly, but I'll say it anyway. It's a weniger aber besser, which means less but better.
Hmm.
And so the goal of life for me is to do less but better. So it's, would you rather do 100 things of sort of mediocre quality, or do you want to do like 5 things that are pretty good that you feel good about? And that was kind of that was how I sort of changed my life. It was just like I was just doing too much, and I realized like none of this is making me happy. It's putting a strain on my personal life. It's putting a strain on my health. It's putting a strain on my marriage. I'm like, I'm not doing this anymore. And so that was it. And that sort of started my transformation. That was how I lost 65 pounds. It's how I turned my health around. It's how I got my new job, which is a permanent job. And so, yeah, it was basically realizing like what actually matters. And that's a question that I think we always have to come back to is what actually matters in life? What is important? Because if we're not doing that, then in a lot of ways, we're just sort of reacting to life instead of being proactive about it.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I covered on my other show, That's BS. We did a dual set of podcasts on Nietzsche's work, and well, specifically, "Thus Spoke Zarathustra," and I covered it. Actually, it was sort of like part of the reason, the motivation to do Plato's Cave, the podcast that we're on now, and it's just I don't know. I'm not familiar with all of his work, but Thus Spoke Zarathustra just hit home for me so powerfully in the sense that like wow, I mean it made me really reflect and look at things that I do and we all do that it's just inscrutable why we do it, but for the mere repetition that we've done it before. You know what I mean? It's just like I find there's so much in life that is either expected of you to do or you find yourself doing it, and it's insane to kind of step back and like Nietzsche says, it's a really scary thing to do and it's a really difficult thing to do, to step back and just say, wow, if I'm brutally honest with myself, what if I could only keep, like you said, if I could only keep 5 things in my life, what would those 5 things be? And then actually evaluate if the other things are actually bringing you any joy or not, and if you want to keep them. So his work has really affected me the past couple months.
Oh yeah, I think Nietzsche's great, and a lot of my understanding of Nietzsche is through Walter Kaufmann, the great translator and biographer of Nietzsche. And one of the things that I take from sort of existentialism broadly, as someone who's I've read Kierkegaard, I've read Sartre, is this idea of sort of affirming life regardless of whether or not it has any meaning, right?
Mm-hmm.
And especially that comes out of Sartre too, is that like there really is no ultimate meaning to any of this, right? And we sort of make our own meaning, and the meanings that we make matter because they relate to us. And that there we have to have an affirmative yes to life. You have to have that sense of saying yes to life, but not saying yes to everything about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, it's always been about thinking consciously about, do I need to buy that thing? Do I need to do this thing? Do I have to go to this social engagement? Do I really wear that sweater? Like, those are all things that matter to me that I think about more and more and more and more. My closet now fits basically about half a walk-in closet. The other half is my wife's, and then we have a whole other bedroom, which is the office I'm in, that has a whole other walk-in closet. But we all have our vices, right? So like hers is clothes, like she likes having that. Mine is books. So yeah, I may only have half a walk-in closet of clothes, but I have 4 bookshelves. So it's just, it's not saying no to everything. There are some people, who do the whole 50 items in a bag and that's all they own thing. And I think that's cool. That's fine. Or the people who have tiny houses. But, essentialism to me is about finding what truly is essential to you. It's about, whittling down the unnecessary, excuse me, it's about whittling down the unnecessary to make what McEwen calls your greatest possible contribution. And how can you make that greatest possible contribution when you got all this other distracting stuff around you? And I think particularly in the COVID crisis that we're living through now, this lesson is bigger than ever in the sense that we're really realizing what's actually important. We're realizing that what's actually important are the sanitation workers and the restaurateurs and the people who bag your groceries and ring you out. It's not the hedge fund managers, it's not the bankers, it's not the politicians, it's the people actually doing the work. They're the ones who are actually essential, right? And so like that, I think, is the thing about my hope coming out of this crisis, is that there's a shift in values where people understand the value of, maybe we shouldn't be living in a society in which there's so much excess and so much of it goes to so few people at the expense of everyone else. So that's, I think, the other component to it as well.
Yeah, no, it's been a weirdly clarifying time. I've kind of missed doing things that I took very much for granted in, what almost feels like a previous life at this point. And it's funny because, there are things that there's almost sort of like a barrier to entry to doing them, but like once you're doing them, and especially having reflected upon doing them, you're really happy to like have done those things. And I don't know, like it's just really simple things like going outside and like throwing a frisbee with friends in the park, or I mean, doing those things is sometimes you kind of have to, you have to harangue friends to do it every once in a while, and people, yeah, I'm lazy. I just, I could, but I want to watch YouTube in bed or something like that. It's just like, no, come on, let's do that. So I'm really hoping that when we emerge from this, I hope like a lust for those activities has been reignited in a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things my wife and I try to do every day is take a walk. We didn't get to walk today because it's sort of rainy here in Indiana, but we try to walk every day. We walk for about 30 minutes, and we spend that walking time having a conversation with each other and just enjoying each other's company. And those little things matter. Those little bits of time where you're doing something meaningful and really appreciating the moment you're in matter. And so those are the things I've really appreciated in this whole endeavor. I think the other thing I've really just appreciated is the fact that like there's absolutely no need for me to be in my office every day. I have an office job, and I've
Yeah,
realized like
yeah.
so much of what I can do from home. And just the amount of like gas that I've saved and the amount of time that I've saved not having to drive every single day to somewhere has
Yeah.
been just wonderful. I haven't actually had to refill my car since this whole thing started.
Yeah.
It's, which is crazy because like I had just filled my gas tank right before all this happened, because basically I went into lockdown on March 17th, on St. Patrick's Day. And then
Okay.
March 18th was the first day that I was sort of in lockdown. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the big thing that, I've just realized like, wow, like there's just so much of this that doesn't matter. And then it opens up the space for realizing, oh, this is important. That's
Mm.
important. So
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, it's like, it's like what I referenced earlier. There's not really a good reason why we all have to go into the office all the time, but we do. It's just because, that's the system that we're in, and that's kind of what people do. And it's, I think Nietzsche puts it really well when he says like, no, like, look, it's not about it's not about going into the office. That's not the thing. It's about what cost do you incur by not doing it, right? Um, and it's like I love that like contrapositive way he puts that in, because it's like, wow, there's not a really good reason why I have to wear khakis to work or whatever. But and it's not a big deal that I do either. I shouldn't. It's not that huge a deal. But think about the social cost you would incur if you wore sweatpants or athletic shorts. You know what I mean? Yeah, everyone be what's wrong with that guy? Why isn't he mirroring this social agreement that like, oh, we're here to work and this is how we show that to each other? Because I haven't worn anything with belt loops in, I don't know, a month and a half at this point, and my productivity hasn't gone down, you know?
Yeah, yeah. If anything, mine's gone up, and I think I wore pants one day. There was like one day where I really felt like wearing pants, and the
Yep.
big reason for that was because I wanted to wear a pair of shoes, and the
Hmm.
shoes didn't look quite right unless I wore actual pants.
Okay, okay.
That's the one thing I do miss is I miss wearing my shoes. I have a bunch of different Vans, and I like wearing my Vans shoes. But yeah, like you're absolutely right. I mean, the other thing I think about, because you're thinking about sort of the way Nietzsche sort of has that contrapositive, right?
Mm,
Where, it's dialectical, right? And
mhm,
I'm constantly thinking about, for me as as somebody influenced by Marx and by Marxism, the one thing I think about a lot is just the futility of so much of what goes on in the modern production. Think about all of the stuff that, you know, the economy has 52 different types of toothpaste, but the economy couldn't make enough ventilators to help with this crisis. We
mhm,
actually literally had to take over industries to make them make the things that we need. And it goes to show you that like there's this like contradiction at the heart of sort of neoliberal capitalism where you have this idea that it's super efficient, but its efficiency, quote unquote efficiency, is built on other inefficiencies within it. And that's the dialectical part. So when you hear from sort of mainstream economists, you hear, well, it's super efficient because people can get the things they need at a price that's affordable, blah, blah, blah. But at the
mhm,
same time, it's incredibly inefficient because there's so much that ends up being wasted. Look at the food crisis we're living in right now, where you have dairy farmers are literally destroying milk or trying to give it away because they can't sell it, right?
mhm.
So we have this a huge excess of milk and we have this huge excess of other foods, but then you have other people who can't get basic foodstuffs out of, it's an incredible amount of inefficiency within a system that was supposedly told to be efficient. And I think that's understanding those underlying dynamics, and I think understanding that dialectical approach is
Mhm.
important in understanding the crisis we're in now.
Yeah, yeah. No, the way I guess I've always kind of thought about that in slightly different terms, but it seems to be along the lines that you're talking about, where I mean, it seems as though, the capitalistic markets are efficient at producing, kind of, consumer goods on their own terms, but it always seems like they don't have the power um, to work in any long-term time scale, producing things now so that if a contingency happens later down the line, we're not going to all die. And B, it doesn't seem to be a system that can export robust values either. It just doesn't seem to be able to weigh in with any sort of power on what we ought to be focusing on as opposed to just merely focusing on.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And then I think that one of the challenges that I think we face is how can we change it and how can we reform it in a way that's viable. So for me, one of the things that say like Trump should have done months ago was invoke the Defense Authorization Act. This is a law that was passed during the Truman era to sort of bolster defense production or whatever. And he should have invoked that like in November and said like General Motors, you're going to start making this stuff because we anticipate this problem.
Mm,
And that level of planning works when you have people at the top who value the planning. The problem is that you had a lot of people who had short-term interests, and you're right. This is the great point I think you made about the capitalism we live under is incredibly focused on the short term. It doesn't really care about the sort of long term of things. This is where it sort of falls apart because it doesn't anticipate what's going to happen in the future, which is why literally within a matter of weeks, the whole thing collapsed, right? And this happens all the time. I'm 29 years old. I'll be 30 in July. In my lifetime, there have been three major economic crises. There was the dot-com bubble crashing in 2000. You had the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008, and now this in 2020. And those individual things are not the reasons why those crashes happened. Those were sort of the triggers that sort of set it off. But the underlying conditions underneath of what was going on within the system at the time could not handle the shock of, say, the dot-com bubble bursting, or it couldn't handle the subprime mortgage crisis, or couldn't handle coronavirus. And this is not a point I'm making. I'm paraphrasing the Marxist economist Richard Wolff, who makes the same point about saying, like, we live in a system that is perpetually fueled by crises, and in crises we don't tend to benefit from. So it's a matter of figuring out, how do we make a system that is more equitable? And I would argue the way you do that is, to me, it's about, it's basically taking over these industries and then giving them over democratically to workers. Like, that's what I would do, right? Some people have different approaches, whether it's more Keynesian spending or whatever. But it's a healthy debate we have to have, because I think one of the big things that's important about what we're living in now is that it cannot stay the same. This has to change, because we can't go back to business as usual. We can't go back to normalcy, because there wasn't normalcy to begin with. So we have to really fundamentally shift it to something that works more for everyone, rather than just the people who normally benefit from these kinds of things.
Yeah, this isn't my particular hobby horse, and it's always been no. It's interesting to me, but there's sort of a it's funny, it's always easier to diagnose problems than to create solutions,
Totally,
and it's
absolutely.
I love kind of learning about this stuff, but I honestly have kind of a blank spot in my mind when it comes to what's your proposed solution then, to all these problems, because I frankly just don't know enough about this, this area. But I want to circle back, but one thing that I was kind of thinking about today, actually, I was on a run and this thought occurred to me. It almost seems like I wonder. I saw some tweet. It came up on my newsfeed about it was comparing the I believe it was the unemployment rates across different countries. The U.S. it was comparing it to France and Germany, I think, who experienced between a 2 and 4 fold increase in their unemployment. It rose from high 3s, low 4s percentage to high 8s, low 9s percentage, or something like that. I can't remember the exact numbers. And the U.S.'s went from something like 3.9 to 33% or something like that. I mean, we're off the charts right now. And the one thing that I kind of was struck by is I wonder if the lack of protection that we're providing right now to small businesses and individuals is going to leave us at the point where, when we can all leave our houses and go back to work, the people who had a small business who lost, their life savings maybe, aren't going to be able to restart those businesses. And the only thing that's going to survive are huge corporations and monopolies. And we're all just going to be working at Walmart at some point.
You're absolutely right. It's ironic that you bring that up, because this is something that I find is absolutely correct. And if you look at what's going on right now, in terms of what that first big stimulus package that they passed a few weeks ago, if you really look at who benefited from that, Matt Taibbi does really great reporting on this. He writes for Rolling Stone, and he wrote about the 2008 financial crash, and he's writing about this particular problem on his website. And he made a point of saying that, like, the vast majority of the gains of the stimulus package that was just passed a few weeks ago is about 43,000 people in the United States. There are 43,000 people in the United States who have incomes well over $1 million, and they're the people who most benefited from it. And the way that they most benefited from it was not so much in the direct stimulus spending, but in all of the literally trillions of dollars of backdoor loans from the Federal Reserve, right? So the Federal Reserve over the last 2 months has basically pumped somewhere between $2 and $4 trillion into the United States economy through what they call quantitative easing, which is basically printing money. It's flowing money, cheap money into the market in order to stave off liquidity problems. And This does not benefit your average worker, right? Because the vast majority of Americans don't have stocks, they don't have bonds. And if they do, most of them are tied up into retirement accounts. They're not people who are individual investors.
Mm.
So we have a system that when it gets bailed out, and it gets bailed out a lot, especially in our lifetimes, the last 20 years, the U.S. economy has essentially been bailed out twice. This time is bigger than the last time. And what you've seen after what happened after the 2008 crash, you saw exactly what you described, which is a consolidation of businesses. And the way that that happened was that these things are always fueled by debt, right? The dot-com bubble was fueled by overly inflated stock prices for tech companies. The mortgage crisis was fueled by horrible loans that were given out with no oversight, which then were turned into what they called mortgage-backed securities.
Mm.
Those were changed then, and then you have now where you have that was fueled by debt. The mortgage crisis was fueled by debt, and now we're in another area where it's fueled by debt, but it's debt that is on the company's balance sheet because companies have leveraged themselves to hell. And anyway, this probably sounds kind of boring. My main point is that you're absolutely right. When you have periods of crisis like this, where the government takes a direct hand in sort of propping up the system, the only inevitable result is the concentration of that system. Because there's no way that they're going to be able to really save the small businesses. Because the first stimulus they did, they had $359 billion worth of stimulus spending in it. That went out within a matter of literally days. It was gone, right? And so when you see what Congress is doing now, you have very little spending for hospitals. You have very little spending for testing. You have no spending or back pay for essential workers who should basically be paid double, if not more. You have all these other things where what they're really looking out for is not the interests of the average working person. They're really interested in saving the system. And in order to do that, they have to basically deal with all of the debt that the sort of finance sector has taken on over the last 10 years since the quote unquote recovery of 2010. So yeah, I mean, the whole thing's a mess. And because we're all at home, like when 2008 happened, like I was in high school, right? Like I remember coming home the day that Lehman Brothers collapsed and the federal government had to take it over. I remember that. I remember coming home. I remember still going to school during all of that. I remember all of that. We're all at home. So we don't see how truly awful it is. And we won't know how truly awful it is until we all go back outside and we all go back into the world. That's when we'll realize, oh my God, this was catastrophic. And it's because we don't have robust social democratic policies in this country. We just don't. That's why France and Germany are able to handle this a lot better. Because they have robust social safety net systems in a way the United States doesn't, because either one, we never made them in the first place, or they've been starved for decades. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean that's super interesting. So I'm assuming, but please tell me what you think about this, that a sort of maybe like something similar to a UBI-based stimulus package would have actually done more because of, the Keynesian multiplier effect for propensity to consume versus propensity to save. Is that kind of the alternative you're advocating for?
In some respects, yeah. I mean, I think that's a start. So one of the things that Canada has been doing they have basically been offering their citizens $2,000 a month every month through the continuation of the crisis. So it's probably going to go into the fall. What you're seeing in some of the more directly Scandinavian countries, I think Finland, or they're offering 75% of pay for workers. They're doing that in Denmark, Netherlands. Yeah. They're all doing this, right? So they're basically saying you're not going to be laid off, you're going to be furloughed. And then when the economy boosts back up, then you can do that, right? The United States, instead of doing any of that, we did a one-time check of $1,200 for individuals, $2,400 for couples, which I have not received yet.
Yeah, I haven't either.
So, and I paid my taxes a month in advance this year. I should have gotten my money. Okay. I want my Trump bucks. But anyway, but you're absolutely right. I mean, I think a UBI is totally right on the money. I think another thing that we needed to do was we needed to extend hazard pay for essential workers. I think that's the other thing. Definitely extending unemployment benefits. All of those things are definitely important. And had we taken more of the money instead of bailing out Wall Street like we always tend to do, if you're to put more of that money actually into the real economy of real living, breathing, thinking, feeling human beings, maybe our economy would be a little bit better off. That's why you're seeing this huge amount of unemployment, because so much of our economy, especially the post 2008 economy, is built on what, and I can't remember the first time I ever read this, but it's based on what they call the precariat. Basically, it's like the proletariat, but they're precarious. And what that means is basically you have like part-time workers, people who technically work full-time, but they're actually considered part-time under the rules. So they don't have health insurance, they don't have any kind of protections.
Yeah.
You have gig workers, people who work for Uber or Grubhub or whatever, who are considered independent contractors, even though that's not really what they are. And then so you have all those things. We're one of the only major industrialized countries in the world that doesn't have paid medical and family leave. So like there's all kinds of things that we should be doing, and UBI is definitely one of them. And advocating for that is essential. I think the other thing that's absolutely essential, and it's a very big value proposition is Medicare for all. That we need to move away from a proprietary healthcare system into a single payer, publicly funded healthcare system that would cover all Americans. If the United States had that, our recovery would be much less what it is and more like South Korea, or would be much more like, I know this is going to trigger some people, but it'd be a lot more like Cuba, where they've actually helped stave off a lot of the crisis in their home country and now sending doctors overseas to help people. Vietnam is another great example of that. Vietnam has a very robust public health system. And because they are a largely socialist country, they were able to sort of plan and implement a lot of this out farther than other countries were. So that's really what I'm advocating for is, yes, it's Keynesianism, but we need to go beyond that and actually advocate for some kind of form of planned economy or some form of socialism that would actually really put real value into regular people and not just the financial system.
Yeah, I guess the main driver for me on Medicare for all is more of a normative argument than a sort of descriptively financial one. Even though that does make sense to me too. It doesn't seem reasonable ethically in this day and time that people's health is something to be used in a profit margin. It just doesn't seem, I'm assuming that most of us would agree that the point of living in a society at this point is to reap the benefits of a society, and it seems like that would just be one of the first that we would want to secure is I can't remember who said this with respect to COVID, but he or she said when someone gets sick in America, it's secondarily a health crisis. It's firstly a financial crisis, and speaking as a young adult in America, and I'm sure you can empathize with this. It's true. There are undoubtedly checkups that I neglect to have, or just like, my shoulder's been kind of bothering me the last couple of days. And, obviously preventative care aside because of the health complications. If we were in normal times, I probably wouldn't go get it checked out. I would just see if it got better in a couple of weeks because it's going to cost a dumb amount of money to do that. And it just, yeah, it seems ethically speaking, whatever you think of, even if it was less efficient and cost more money, it seems like that's kind of something that we want to secure as a society. Which, you have to think the goal of a society is to benefit the individuals in the society, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's that connection between the individual and the society is incredibly important. So there's a economist from the 20th century who wrote a great book called The Great Transformation. It's a guy named Karl Polanyi. In the book, he sort of makes the argument for large, robust social spending like a single-payer healthcare system. And one of the arguments that he makes is that one of the arguments against sort of socialism or social democracy or planning or whatever is that, it's a loss of freedom to the individual, that individuals will be harmed in this system. Now, that's not to say that that hasn't happened in more authoritarian regimes. That has. But that's not by default. And what Polanyi makes an argument of is that actually when you actually invest in society and you provide people with basic needs, that actually gives them a lot more freedom and individuality than they would have before. It actually allows them to be much more of an individual than they would have been under a traditional system. And so it allows you to do a lot more with your life because you don't have to worry about the constant financial burden of, oh, do I have the money to afford this test? Oh, do I
Mm.
have the money to afford this treatment? That should never be the in a society as wealthy as ours, that should never ever be the argument. And and it's basically we burden people with debt in order for the excesses of our the surplus of capital to go to the capitalists. It doesn't go to the people who actually make the value. And so for me, I think that actually having a system that is more, whatever you want to call it, social democratic, socialist, whatever,
Mm.
actually gives people a lot more freedom, and because it frees them from the burdens of stuff that should be taken care of socially.
Hmm. Yeah, we were talking about this on That's BS a couple episodes back, but it, I remember my biggest sort of hang up with the libertarian perspective on this is that it does seem to be sort of one of those systems where you trade kind of imagined temporary liberty for long-term loss of liberty, right? Where, if you sort of, you advocate for just like an open market, let the a congregation of individual atomistic forces decide what gets done. In the short term, yes, I understand the impulse to say that that gives you more freedom, but I'm not sure it actually does in the long term. And as a historian, you can probably speak to historical examples of this more than I can, but um, it just seems like game theoretically speaking, it has in the U.S.'s history, if not other countries, led to a congregation of power in exceedingly a fewer and fewer percentage of the population, which then limits the freedoms of the rest. Technically speaking.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And that's the contradiction at the heart of libertarianism, at least sort of in America, right? Because
Hmm.
libertarianism as a concept was actually a politically left term for much of
Yeah.
modern history. When you spoke of libertarian, we weren't talking about Milton Friedman. We were talking
Mm.
about, Mikhail Bakunin and Emma Goldman and the anarchists. That's who, the left anarchists. That's who we were actually talking about. They sort of perverted and took the term. But anyway, you're right. The central contradiction within modern libertarianism is in order to achieve the amount of economic liberalism that they want, the sort of open markets, free trade, low regulations, this and that, and that, you actually have to have an incredibly large and authoritative state to achieve it.
Mm.
And so this is the central crux, right? So there's a wonderful book by Naomi Klein called The Shock Doctrine that's all about how this plays out.
Mm.
And the example that she uses is 1973, Chile, South American country. They had elected a democratically elected socialist leader named Dr. Salvador Allende. Allende was basically an enemy of the United States, not for any particular like authoritarian or brutal reason, but precisely because he was it was an out left government in South America, which the United States has an incredible track record of destroying because they don't like it. And what they sort of did in that country was they led a coup, a coup d'état, a brutal uprising of power from the
Hmm.
Allende government. And with the backing of the CIA, they installed this dictator named Augusto Pinochet. And this happened on September 11th, 1973. It's what Noam Chomsky calls the first 9/11. And so what happens then is that Milton Friedman, the economist, very well known economist, libertarian, monetarist economist from the United States, and was very well known with the sort of the Chicago School of Economics at the University of Chicago. Milton Friedman was a student of F.A. Hayek. In the Austrian School of Economics, again, libertarianism, free markets, limited government, low regulations. And what they did in Chile was essentially push forward economic liberalism and a move away from socialism or social democracy in Chile. And they did it using an incredibly authoritarian government to do it. And if you look at most countries in the ways that that happened, that's exactly the case, right? So this happened in Russia, post-Soviet Union. When Boris Yeltsin was elected president of the Russian Federation, there was a period of time where the Duma, the legislature of Russia, was essentially shut down for a year. And he sort of ruled as a virtual dictator for about a year while the IMF and the World Bank set up the liberalized economy of Russia. I would argue that the sort of libertarian policies of sort of free trade and liberalization, all of those things, and that sort of brutal push for them in a very short amount of time is what gets you people like Vladimir Putin. And the sort of oligarchic system that's in Russia today is directly a result of sort of libertarian economic policy of sort of forcing a society without kind of democratic consent into an economic system that they didn't ask for. So that's one of the things I think that's incredibly important when we understand libertarianism. Libertarianism really isn't about freedom. When you hear people talk about libertarianism, they always say it's freedom, freedom, freedom. I'll follow up with the question, freedom for whom? Mm-hmm. Whom do you wish to have freedom? Who do you want to actually give freedom to? It's not the regular people. The people you actually want to give the freedom to are the financial interests that you're going to benefit from. It's the economic interests. And in my opinion, libertarianism, if left unchecked, leads straight to fascism. There isn't much of a stretch to go from, hard right economics right into hard right authoritarian politics. And look no further than what's going on in Hungary right now. Viktor Orban has essentially declared himself dictator of Hungary. Again, it's a former post-Soviet state that liberalized very quickly without really liberalizing democratically and politically. So I think that libertarianism is a farce. I think it's a fairy tale that people tell themselves to feel good about stepping on other people. And I think that, it's something people need to get over. And realize it doesn't work. And this whole crisis we're going through right now proves to you that libertarianism just doesn't work.
Yeah, the thing, and I know I've tended to agree with you this entire time, and it's because I kind of have, but like I said, it's one thing for me to diagnose the problem, which is relatively easy. It's another to propose a better solution. So what, I guess it's funny. There is this sort of like more Republican part of my brain that is just, it's watched too many PragerU videos or something, and it's it's kind of, it's worrying about the implications of going to a more I guess you can call it extreme, but maybe that's just categorizing it wrong, but solution of a sort of more socialist or a more democratic socialist solution to this. What are in your mind, like the main, because there are obviously terrible arguments against it, but what are some of the better ones that you've heard?
So the better arguments sort of against, so are you seeing better arguments against socialism?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think one of the better arguments against socialism is a loss of democracy. So if you look at the history of the world, particularly when you look at sort of sustained socialist governments in the world, right? Mm-hmm. So the first real experiment in socialism that had any kind of staying power outside of the Paris Commune, which you can sort of in 1871, where Paris was essentially ruled by a communist government for a matter of, I think, like 3 months before the counter-revolutionary forces shut it down, is the Soviet Union. And if you really look at the history of the Soviet Union, early on, right? So if you're thinking about the earlier period, right as the revolution's happening, you see a widespread amount of democratic reforms that actually do happen. So you see universal suffrage of directly elected representatives who are subject to recall, and you also see this sort of decriminalization of a lot of activities, particularly homosexuality was decriminalized in the Soviet Union before the Stalinist period. So you have all of those things that happen, right? Mm-hmm. The problem with implementing socialism is that, in my opinion, implementing socialism in a country requires a certain level of development. And this is Marx's point, where in order for the country he thought that would go socialist was not Russia. He thought it was the United States. And precisely for this reason was because the United States had a certain level of economic development that allowed it to transition to socialism. You know, the Soviet Union basically went from being a feudal peasant society, very, very poor, to an industrial power within 20 years. And in order to achieve some of that, you needed to have essentially an increased amount of statism and bureaucratization to achieve it. And that's where Stalin comes in. This is one of the stronger arguments against socialism, I think, is that it leads to bureaucratization. It leads to an increasingly authoritarian statism that is harmful to individual liberty, that is harmful to democratic rights, and that's harmful to democracy. Those are real issues that we have to deal with. And those are real issues that I constantly think about as a socialist, what I would argue for, which is why the value of democratic socialism and why I advocate for sort of democratic socialism is this idea that we cannot let go of the gains of liberal democracy. We only need to expand them. And so, you know, for me, what socialism is it's not just abandoning everything that we've achieved. It's building upon it. So the way that we do that, the way we sort of ensure democracy within a socialist framework for me is by maintaining strong democratic norms, by maintaining elections, by maintaining political rights, by not throwing out the Bill of Rights, by not throwing out the Constitution, by having a set of core principles and values, you know, something like a UN Declaration of Human Rights. All of those are valuable to keep. And that what we seek to do is to take democracy and expand it into the economy. We sort of, or we're very big about democracy until we start talking about the workplace. And it's like, no, we actually have to democratize the workplace too. So like I mentioned him earlier, the economist Richard Wolff, he's written a great book about this called Democracy at Work, where he makes the argument for worker-owned co-ops. And if you look around the world, worker co-ops are incredibly successful. You know, there are about 6,000 of them in the United States. I don't know how many are them now, but that was the last number before the COVID-19 outbreak.
Yeah.
One of them is in Baltimore, Maryland. It's called Red Emma's. It's a restaurant and a bookstore. And it is owned by the workers. They collectively make the decisions democratically. And they have a certain level of planning within the system itself. The largest co-op that's very successful is known as the Mondragon Corporation out of Spain. You know, it employs, I think, something like 60,000 people, immensely successful, immensely large, but it's incredibly democratic, and it's worker-owned. Now, will there always be inequities? Yes. Unfortunately, that's just, I think, human nature. I don't think we're ever going to the goal is not for everybody to be absolutely equal. That was never what Marx ever advocated for, or any socialist really advocate for, other than
that'd be terrible. Yeah.
That'd be terrible, right? That's sort of what the bourgeois utopian socialists would have argued for, which Marx and Engels said, no, we're not utopian socialists. Is actually the pay divide between like the highest paid person in the Mondragon Corporation and like the regular employee is like 8-to-1. Whereas like in the United States, like the average CEO to average worker is like 350-to-1, right?
Yeah.
So the goal is to change the system in a way that is in keeping with democratic and human rights. That we embrace humanism, that we embrace the sort of values, the good values of liberalism and the good values of the Enlightenment, and not abandon them. And I think that's the way we achieve it. So I think, to me, that's the strongest argument against socialism, is that it does lead inexorably to authoritarian politics. And I think we have to have, I think, a very robust and healthy discussion about how to avoid that. Because, you know, the Soviet Union collapsed, 31 years. And, I was born in 1990. I was born right as the Soviet Union was collapsing. I've never grown up in a society with the Soviet Union that I can remember, right? Communist China, is basically become state capitalism. They're not, they're called the communist government or whatever. They're the People's Republic, but it's a state capitalist system and incredibly repressive, right? So we have to make a stronger argument as socialists that we are going to create a system that is in fact democratic. Because to me, that's what socialism is. It's the expansion of democracy beyond the political realm and into the economic realm. And if you're losing that sense of democracy, then the game is up. So that's, I think, to me, a really strong argument against socialism. And what I've said as well is a good way of sort of counteracting that and having that discussion.
Yeah, I guess you alluded to it, but there is, I guess there is this. It's not completely unfounded fear that because it's harder to raise sort of the bottom of the barrel than to push down the top of the barrel, that it does, you get the arguments that it intrinsically and inherently leads to an authoritarian state. Um, and it's weird because it does, I mean, it does seem like the first, obvious solutions is to push the top down because it's way easier to tax, um, the multimillionaire CEOs than to somehow bring up, the lowest people in the lowest roles in society. And I see, it is, in a very Kantian sense, it is a violation of that person's autonomy to push them down in one sense. And then in another sense, you have to look at how they actually made that money. Because, there's, the phrasing of a self-made man, right? But even the quintessential self-made man isn't in a true sense self-made. I mean, because everyone's benefited from the architecture of the system in which they got to the top end. It's only possible for Bill Gates to be Bill Gates because of the system that he was he was arbitrarily born into. So no one really owns their success all the way down. But I do understand and am sympathetic to the concerns of the violation of autonomy to any individual in the system.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think one of the other problems that I think pitching socialism to people has is that, oh, well, people will have no incentive to do innovative things. They won't have ambition, this and that and the other. And I think that's a value. I think that's a viable question. I think that's an important question. So one of the things I would say is, when we're talking about sort of safe, self-made people and this and that, I think it's important for us to have a real conversation about who really creates wealth and having a conversation of what that means, right? So this is where we can get into sort of the sort of overarching paradigms of the ideology of neoliberalism that we live under now is the theory of marginal utility. That's sort of the central theory behind how prices are set in an economy like this. So the theory of marginal utility comes out of the late 19th century. It's actually a response to Marx and the classical economists. So to back up for a minute, Marx's central view of capital was based on what is called the labor theory of value, which is not an idea he came up with. It's an idea he actually got from the classical economists, Adam Smith and David Ricardo. And what the labor theory of value says is that the value of an item is directly related to the amount of labor put into it. And what Marx does is he breaks it down into three categories. You have value as a whole, and then you have two other subsets. You have what's called use value and exchange value. Use value is the amount of use, the kind of value you can get out of using something. So like right now, we're using microphones. They have a use value, right? But there's also what's called an exchange value. So let's say I'm down to my last dollar and I need to eat. I can take this microphone that I'm using and I can sell it on the market for what it's worth for a level of exchange. It then becomes what Marx calls a commodity. And Marx's central insight in sort of extending Adam Smith and Ricardo's insight about the labor theory of value is he says the surplus that's created in capital, what you call profits, the way you create those profits is by underpaying the people who create the labor. So when you go to a job and you're paid $10 an hour for the work, you're actually worth a hell of a lot more than the $10 they pay you. But they don't, because the use value is trumped by the exchange value. And the exchange value is the one that matters more. And so the classical economists of the late 19th century, particularly a guy named Jevons, who was a student of John Stuart Mill, he and a bunch of others, Hans Hermann Bawerk, who was one of the influences of Hayek and Ludwig von Mises of the Austrian school, they came up with the theory of marginal utility. It said, no. Labor is not the central node of value. It's utility. And so I heard a libertarian economist explain it to you this way. If you could put all of the labor in the world into the most beautiful fireplace,
Mm.
you could do the most intricate wood paneling, you could put so much time into it. And you could go up to a person and says, I want $15,000 for this fireplace. And the person can say to you, I don't care what you want, I'll pay you 12. And no, but it's worth 15. I put $15,000 worth of labor in this. I want $15,000. No, I'll pay you 12. Because that's the value of the utility of it to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so it changes the exchange, the concept of value from being objective, meaning $15,000 of objective value of something, into subjective value.
Mm.
And that's the shift that happens. So I think for us, one of the things we need to do is reclaim not just Karl Marx, but Adam Smith. We need to reclaim this sort of labor theory of value and make the case that like the reason that Jeff Bezos is worth $150 billion is because that amount of wealth is stuff that he has not, it's an incredible amount of surplus exchange value that he's not giving back to the people who actually created the value in it.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the question, right? And then so that's one of the other things. And so the other component to this is talking about like, oh, well, socialism sort of destroys ambition, this and that and the other. Mm. The problem, I think, with that is that if you look at the Soviet Union, and again, flaws and all, the Soviet Union was a brutal authoritarian state. This is what I'm about to say is not apologetics. Mm-hmm. What I'm going to say is this: that country with a planned economy went from being a rural peasant backwater to the second largest superpower in the world in a period of about 30 years. So this idea that economy can't grow based on planning and that that ambition would go out the window is total nonsense, right? Mm-hmm. If you look at the Soviet space program, and how advanced the Soviet space program was. At the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were more doctors in the Soviet Union than the United States and a couple other countries combined. So this idea that ambition is just destroyed in a socialist system is nonsense. To me, I think what actually does sort of tamper down innovation, what actually tampers down the incentive to be ambitious, is to live in a system where you work really, really, really hard and continue to get less and less and less and less for it. Well, Jeff Bezos has $150 billion. That doesn't give me an incredible amount of incentive to work harder,
Yeah.
No amount of hustling is going to fix the system that you live in.
Yeah.
That was a bit all over the place, but hopefully that,
No, that's super interesting. I'm going to have to re-listen to this and just kind of mull over a lot of these points because it really is something that, this topic I've had an interest in for a long time, but it's really just sort of an interest, I understand that for me to learn enough to have like an opinion I'm willing to kind of just put a flag in the ground on and fight for is going to be a ton of research and effort. And I think it's an incredibly complicated topic. My current position would be just to advocate for, it's almost, it sounds kind of too commonsensical, just to advocate for sort of just, take the best bits of what each system can do and cobble that together in a very sort of, I think Finland is doing this right now, but they sort of take a really empirical approach to passing policies. They'll pass a policy for, and correct me if I'm wrong if you know this better, but I think they're experimenting now with passing UBI for maybe a set amount of time or something like that, and just looking at whether or not it works. And if it works, then keep it, and if it doesn't, then don't. And it just seems like there's some weird abhorrence to that experimental sort of economics in the United States,
which is really strange to me. Yeah. Because as a historian, if you really look at the revolutionary period, there was an incredible amount of sort of political and economic experimentation. The godfather of UBI is Thomas Paine. He advocated for it in the book I told you about earlier, Agrarian Justice, where he makes the argument that that there should be a certain amount of grain that goes to everybody every month or every week based on the surplus. He made that argument, right? The founders very much believed in having an experimental kind of democracy. They didn't believe in this idea of it being very rigid, particularly when it comes to Jefferson. Jefferson believed that, and Hamilton too, and Madison, they all believed in the idea of having a sort of vibrant democracy, a sort of a vibrant republicanism that would sort of mold and change with time. And that's the biggest problem I have with the United States, is it seems to me for basically since we've won the Cold War, the country really hasn't changed, like politically. The last time we passed the last time a constitutional amendment was ratified in this country was like 1994,
Yeah.
and it was for limiting Congress people to not give themselves raises during his legislative term. That was what it was, right? And even that amendment itself was introduced in 1787. It was introduced at the original
Took that long to
Constitutional
pass.
Convention,
Yeah.
and it took them that long to pass
Yeah.
it. That's the last one.
Yeah.
So I think like the fact that we haven't done that, to me, there are things right off the bat that we could do that would be amazing. One is the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, which almost passed in the 1970s. The ERA was called the Equal Rights Amendment. It was basically, it would guarantee equal treatment under the law on the basis of sex. And it was pushed very, very strongly. Both parties supported it. You had, Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford supported it. It was incredibly bipartisan, and it got passed by Congress, and it was ratified by all states except for one more than it needed. And what stopped it was a right-wing zealot named Phyllis Schlafly, who basically believed that if we passed the ERA, we would lead into this sort of like hellscape where women dominated men and this and that and the other. She was also an extremely right-wing sort of Christian conservative. And so the ERA is something we should do like right off the bat, right?
Yeah.
Congress should just repass it, have it be ratified by the states. That would be a huge shift in the consciousness, right? And imagine if the ERA didn't just protect men and women. What if it protected all genders, and really gave substantive constitutional protections for trans people? Like that, to me, that's like right off the bat. The other thing we could do is pass a UBI, Social Security for all, that everyone gets Social Security, everyone gets Medicare. Everybody gets these things, and politicians used to be that bold. One of my favorite my favorite president is Lincoln, but my second favorite president is Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt introduced at the end of his presidency, toward the ends of his life, something he called the Economic Bill of Rights, where he laid out that everybody should be entitled to a certain amount of subsistence in their lives. Everyone is entitled to housing. Everyone is entitled to food. Everyone's entitled to a job. Everyone's entitled to health care. And it's in laying it all out and making the case that these are basic bedrock American rights that everybody should have. And so that's, I think, the other thing we need to talk about is the idea that socialism isn't this like weird, scary thing. Like socialism or social democracy or whatever you want to call it is as American as apple pie. It is built into our DNA as a country, from Thomas Paine, Victor Debs, who ran in the Socialist Party ticket multiple times, who advocated for the 8-hour workday, advocated for old age pensions, which would become Social Security, all the way up to FDR, and to and up to people like AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or Bernie Sanders, is this argument that the United States is the healthiest and is the wealthiest country on earth. We have an obligation to our citizens to provide them with these basic rights, alongside freedom of speech, alongside freedom of worship, alongside freedom of due process. You should be guaranteed certain basic economic rights. And that is the way you sort of sell it. And so that's what I would advocate for. But you don't really see that in either party. Most of our politicians don't talk about any of this. This is a way of advocating for more democracy and more social democratic or socialist ideas without alienating people, because they are as American as apple pie. They're not this weird, scary thing. So, to me, that's what we should do and advocate for.
Yeah, no, it does. There's this really weird and it's kind of almost, it's hard to break into the details of it and understand why, but there is this almost weird politicization of all of these ideas, when you bundle them into these isms, and like groups of people, right? And it seems like, I mean, I know, I can't cite which study it was or whatever, but there have been many surveys that, most Americans by and large actually support, um, a lot of the ideas that would fall into what is, classically a socialist bin of ideas, right? And it's just because, I think these ideas just make ethical sense to people, and they make numeric and financial sense to people. It's just when we valence all of these ideas in terms of teams of politics, it seems like that, I mean, that is both what the American system of politics is built on and what is killing it and starving it of oxygen and of change right now. It's just, it's weird. I don't know. I honestly don't know how to get past to that, because it seems like, I mean, look at the situation we're in now, COVID, for instance. If anything should be a bipartisan issue, it's this, right? I mean, it's
Hmm.
just, like, who cares if it's a Republican or a Democrat who comes up with the best solution? Who could possibly care about that? It should just be, let's figure out how to tread water at first, and then see if we can get to shore after that, right? And it doesn't matter if the lifeboat's red or blue. Um, and it's just, I don't know how to work around that tribalist quirk in our psychology, but it seems like that is what has really just run off the rails. Especially, I mean, I'm sure you're aware of it. There are these two. I mean, it's a great chart that shows, the political divide in America over the past few decades, where in the 70s, the attitudes of, Republicans to Democrats and Democrats to Republicans were largely overlapping. People viewed other people as humans who disagreed with them, and now we view each other as the devil incarnate. And it just seems like, I don't know how to get past that problem, but it seems like a crucial problem to get past.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think, at least in my perspective, I mean, I think the way that we sort of help break that gridlock is acknowledging that the Democratic and Republican parties are basically the same.
Mm,
They're not that different. What they're different on is really cultural stuff. So when you're seeing that polarization that happens in the United States, the vast majority of it is related to cultural issues. It's related to things like abortion
mm,
and gay rights, LGBTQ rights. It's guns.
mm,
It's, multiculturalism versus traditionalism. The problem that I think happened with the Democratic Party was that it completely gave up its ground on economic issues and went wholesale into cultural issues.
mm,
So what you see now, in my opinion, within the Democratic Party is that on economics, on the actual material conditions of people, the Democrats aren't that different from Republicans. And if you need any proof of that, just look at these massive bailouts they just gave. You
mm,
know, there were basically no Democrats besides maybe like AOC or Bernie Sanders, who's not even a Democrat, fighting for more worker protections and worker compensation. But the vast majority of the Democrats don't do that, because they're just as wedded to the same system as the Republicans are. It's the
mm,
donor class. The donor class is truly what has broken our politics. Both parties are wedded to donor class money and political consultant money. The way, for me, that we break this gridlock, and the way that I think some on the right, and some on the left can really unite together, is on economic populism. Is that you make the argument that we need policy in this country that actually help the people and not the corporations, not the hedge fund managers, not the party bosses, not the elites, and actually help people. And those are things that can cut across cultural lines, right? This is
mm.
something you can get the most, soy latte drinking liberal and the redneck whiskey drinking conservative to agree on, is that the big man upstairs, the boss, is screwing me over. And that
Mm.
it's about time we have an economic system where it's not so wedded to that, right? You can get libertarians on board with some of this, because a lot of regulations that they don't like
Mm.
actually benefit huge corporations. They don't benefit
Yeah.
regular workers. Liberals can get on board because it's actually going to create a certain level of economic equality, that you're going to have a certain amount of economic benefit for regular people, right?
Mm.
And this divide that exists, in my opinion, the sort of two-party divide in this country is largely a myth. It's something that people have used in order to distract us from what's really going on, which is that there's one overarching ideology that combines both parties together economically, and that is neoliberalism, which is
Mm.
the idea that everything is a market transaction. Everything is left up to the market. Everything is left up to the whims of finances, right?
Mm.
And both parties embraced that. And it started in the 1980s with Reagan. It was basically etched in stone in the 1990s by Bill Clinton. Both parties, presidents of both parties have implemented these kinds of economic policies. And the cultural dressings that they both have are the real divides. If people were to put those cultural things aside for a moment and realize that the elites of this country on both sides of the political spectrum are hell bent on creating an economic system that leaves you behind,
Mm.
that is, I think, a message that resonates with people. And and then just another side thing, not only do we need to embrace that sort of populism, but we need to have a viable left in this country. We do not have a viable left in this country. We
Mm.
have a centrist party in the Democrats, and we have a right-wing party in the Republicans. We do not have a left party. And if you look in American history at all of the great gains of the 20th century, whether it was the 8-hour workday, banning child labor, protections for women, the civil rights movement, voting rights, all of them. Who was at the center of all of it? It was the
Mm.
socialists. It was the communists. It was the trade unionists. It was the radicals. It was the leftists. The
Mm.
leftists were the ones who pushed the mainstream to do what it did. There, in the 1930s, when FDR was president, there was a man named Norman Thomas. He was the presidential candidate on the Socialist Party ticket. Norman Thomas basically advocated for everything that FDR did, but did it 4 to 8 years before FDR did,
Hmm.
and made the argument for Social Security. Made the argument for an 8-hour day. Made an argument for nationalizing the farms. All of it, and you know, and so much so has actually said that he was so disgusted with FDR, he basically said, like, he's put my program in a coffin. But the point is that a lot of the gains of the New Deal Roosevelt era were precisely because of the radical left elements within American politics, the socialists, the communists, the trade unionists, the anarchists. Those are the ones who did it, right? And if you look at what's happened with the Republican Party, it's the exact same thing. If you looked at what's happened post 2008, post George W. Bush, the Republican Party has completely changed and went from being a largely neoliberal, sort of culturally conservative party to being a economically populist, socially conservative party. You went from George W. Bush to Donald J. Trump in 8 years. And a big part of that was the Tea Party, which was the radical fringe. And that Tea Party was what pushed the Republican Party more towards its actual stated goals, which was limited government and cultural conservatism.
Mm.
So the left needs to get bold in this country. It needs to get stronger, and it needs to be a viable alternative for people. That's why I'm thrilled that somebody like Howie Hawkins, an eco-socialist, is running on the Green Party ticket. I was a Bernie Sanders supporter. I was a Bernie Sanders supporter both times. I worked on his campaign the last time around. And so, we need to have that argument of there needs to be a viable left to push the discussion in this country to be more reasonable. And you do
Mm.
that by advocating for, more economically progressive and ideas.
Mm. Yeah, it's just I think we talked about this on the other show before, but it's funny because what's considered left of center in the U.S. is basically the center of most of the rest of the first world.
If not the center right.
Yeah, and it seems like I don't know. I mean, America is such a strange country in this respect, but I feel like we're hashing out the debates of decades ago. Oh, just over and over again. It's just kind of the same. I don't know. I feel like every election almost I'm not that old, so I can't remember a lot of elections, but it just seems like it's a lot of the same issues just rehashed over and over when they're not even the interesting questions. It's just, I mean, they're really not. It should just be, I don't know. I guess it just seems like we really should take just take sort of like a more broad approach to these things and look at what other countries are doing and say, how is the United States different from other countries? And if we can agree on it almost seems like it really we need to focus on the metrics of success rather than solutions first, because it doesn't seem like we're aligned on the metrics of success. Um, it seems like part of the country's metric of success is how rich can you possibly get, and some other people advocate for a metric of success that talks about raising how low you can fall in society. And there's another, aspect of it that talks about how many rights can we protect of certain individuals. And it seems like we're just, we're really much taking the shotgun approach when we should be taking a rifle approach of just, we need to understand what we almost need to dig to the point of values and then look at solutions, because if your solution doesn't address the value that people care about, we need to talk about what values we should care about. It just doesn't seem like a reasonable conversation to have. Well, maybe reasonable, but not useful, not productive.
I could not agree with you more. I think that's the real problem, I think, in American politics specifically. And I think there's so much inertia in this country with our politics, is that it's very technocratic. And if you and what I mean by that is that if you particularly, especially with the Democratic Party, it's not so much the Republican Party, but especially within the Democratic Party, there's this sort of obsession with smartness and this obsession with like degrees and technical fixes. I don't know how much you ever read Vox, but Vox is very much like the mindset of a Vox reader is very much I care a hell of a lot more about the means than I care about the ends. And my thinking on the subject is, if you don't really know what the ends are or what the ends that you want, then what in the world are you actually doing any of this for? There are people who, I think part of the problem with our politics is there's just an obsession with technocracy, and there's an obsession with process. There's an obsession with, but we have to get this amount of people on board. This wouldn't be passed because these people wouldn't vote for it. It has to get through this committee, blah, blah, blah. It's like, when we're having all these like little petty discussions about maneuvering and this and that and the other, we lose sight of like, what are we actually doing? What are the actual values that we're advocating for, right? That's the problem that I have with the Democratic Party in the United States, is that to me, the Democratic Party in the United States is intellectually dead. There's nothing about it that's particularly interesting. That's part of the reason why the most exciting candidate that they've had for the presidential campaign the last two cycles has been a 78-year-old independent socialist from Vermont. It took that for the Democratic Party to get out of its decades-long stupor of being obsessed with technocracy, being obsessed with accreditations and credentials, and instead of actually talking about values. Because when the Democrats do talk about values, it tends to be pretty damned platitudinous. If you want to look at the emptiness of most Democratic Party politics, look at someone like Pete Buttigieg, who every other word out of his mouth is a platitude. But when you actually corner him and ask him, what do you actually believe in? What he actually believes in is corporate centrism. That's what he believes in. Do I believe in Medicare for all? No. Do I believe in a Green New Deal? No. Do I believe in taxing the wealthy? No. But I believe in bringing hope for a new dawn of America. It's like, it's bullshit. I don't want to hear that anymore.
Yeah.
And so people are realizing it's nonsense. So I agree with you. Values come first. In my opinion, politics is based on values. Governing is based on process. You can figure out the governing part when you're in power. You need to make the moral and value-driven argument when you're running. Because if all you're going to do when you're running for president is talk about all of the different plans you have and how I have a 12-point plan for this and I have a 32-slide PowerPoint, I can show you how it works, that kind of politics is totally inept and brain dead. And if you want any example of that, look how hard Elizabeth Warren failed in this recent cycle. Ms. I've got a plan. I don't care if you've got a plan. I don't really care whatever plan you have. What I want to hear is your values, because you can have 857,222 different great plans that are amazing. If they're not backed by any kind of actual value, if they're not based on any core value propositions you hold as a human being, then your plans are up for being perverted, distorted, and destroyed ultimately.
Mm.
And that's the thing. We need to get values back into politics. We have to, in left politics especially. The right's very good at this. They're very good at talking about values. They're very good at it. That's why they win all the time. I
Yeah.
mean, I think they win all the time because they're just better at politics than Democrats are.
Yeah.
I just think they're objectively better at it.
Hmm.
And which is why, like a former first lady, come senator, come secretary of state, lost to a game show host and failed real estate magnate, is because they're
Yeah.
just bad at politics. So
Yeah.
technocracy, in order for democracy to thrive, technocracy has to die. And
Mm.
that's just kind of my view of it.
That's super interesting. That's really, really interesting. So I'm realizing that we're coming close to an hour and a half, and I actually didn't. Well, this is the sign of a good podcast, but I haven't actually asked you any of the prepared questions that I
I am
had.
so sorry.
No,
We went
no,
off the
that's
rails.
no. I'm bringing that out as a metric of the success of
Okay,
the
good, good,
conversation.
good,
Yeah.
good, good.
Um, so I think it's definitely cause for a second appearance. But
Okay.
for now, I guess, because I think I wouldn't want to sort of segment this episode into the talk that we just had, and then also kind of shift to just issues that don't on the surface relate to it.
Okay.
But I think what we've talked about so far is really, really interesting, and I want to listen to this again. And I think people who have made it this far in the conversation are more open-minded than most, because I think both of us have said enough to anger almost any side at this
Oh
point.
my God, yeah. Yeah, I've
Yeah,
made
yep,
everybody mad. I have pissed off your anti-communists, and I've made your woke liberals angry too. So
yeah, yeah.
yeah, that's the value of being a leftist. I'm not a liberal or conservative. I'm not. Like
Hmm.
I'm a leftist. I'm a socialist. So I don't play into that game. So yeah, I piss off everybody. I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Um, so I want to encourage people, because I wanted to discuss a few of your blog posts, which we've been
Oh
reposting a few
yeah,
of
yeah.
on Muckraker Media. But I mean, I think this is fruitful ground for a second conversation for sure. So I guess to close out, I would encourage people to go visit your blog, because there are some great articles on there. And I guess just tell people where they can find that and the rest of your work.
Sure. So everything about me is at justinclark.org. .com was taken. That's why
Ah,
it kind of sounds a little pretentious to have the .org. It was better than .net.
it is.
You
Yeah.
can read my writing there at the blog. I've got some stuff I'm working on. There's a really one of my favorite articles I have up there is about the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek, and
Mm,
talking about Buddhism and its relationship to capitalism. And then the secular humanism of Paul Kurtz, one of my heroes, somebody who knew how to do humanism right,
mm.
and somebody whose view we should really get back to in terms of talking about humanist politics and just humanist philosophy in general. But yeah, justinclark.org. You can also learn about what I do in my day job. I'm the digital initiatives director for the Indiana State Library. I work on digitizing historical collections for a living. You can watch some of the videos I've made about historical topics there, and learn a little bit about what I do as a public historian. And then also definitely check out Muckraker Media. My stuff's on there as well now. And then I've got a few articles that I'm sort of working on right now. I'm working on an article about Isaac Asimov
Mm.
and his leaving of Mensa because he thought IQ people were weird. Um, I'm working on an article about Lenin, Vladimir Lenin, and his view of religion.
Mm.
And I'm working on an article about John Dewey and democracy, which I think is very particularly important for tonight's discussion. So those
Mhm.
are things that will be coming down the pike. I tend to write a lot slower than I read and talk, so bear with me if it doesn't come to you right away. But that's where you can find my stuff.
Yeah. Thank you for that, and thank you again for being on the show. I think it was. I didn't plan to cover any of this, but it was super, super interesting. So thank you.
Thank you. I mean, like I said, I've been cooped up in my house, and my wife can only hear so much of this from me. So I appreciate you humoring me. I hope I
Yeah.
talked more with you than at you,
Yeah, yeah.
because I can get on a roll. So
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you again, and to our listeners, stay on the line, Justin. But to our listeners and viewers, thank you for watching, and tune in next time. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode and learned something from it. All of the show notes to Justin's material I will leave, or all of the references to Justin's material I will leave in the show notes below. And as always, I say this at the end of every episode, but thank you for watching or listening if you're still doing so at this point. You can support my work at patreon.com/Jordan Myers. You can also support this podcast in non-monetary ways by sharing it on Twitter or on social media, rating it on Apple Podcasts so that more people can find it and listen to it. You can like this video or subscribe via YouTube or RSS feed. You can discuss it on your own show and link back to this one, or connect with me in general and recommend guests or topics I can cover, or just get in touch with me for any reason you may have. You can do so at Plato's Cave Podcast at gmail.com or on Twitter at Jordan_C_Myers. And as always, thank you again for listening and for struggling to escape the cave. Until next time, thank you. Plato's Cave is produced by Muckraker Media. You can find out more at muckrakermedia.org.